You know when people tell you, I got good news and I got bad news, which do you want first? It's in that moment you are given the choice to decide how you want to receive this information. Both are true, the good and the bad, we can't change that. But we get a choice in that moment to decide which order our brain and hearts will receive this news. I don't know about you, but the way I answer that question has changed over the years. I used to be a good news first kind of girl. Now I save the good news for last. These days, when the question is posed to me, I find myself answering, give me the bad news first. I won't bore you with all the reasons I think I've come around on answering the question differently. At the most basic, I believe I want to end whatever conversation I'm about to have on a high note. The truth this question holds is its ability to articulate the tension we live in every day. The duality that is ever present in our lives, both the good and the bad, are right there in front of us. Depending on who is asking you this question, sometimes the good and the bad are obvious. You might know what they are going to say, the doctor, the car mechanic, your child, your spouse. The news they are about to share is known. Other times, news that people share is shocking. It takes your breath away. It brings you to your knees. I had no idea, completely out of the blue, couldn't have guessed it if you tried, kind of news. In our gospel reading today, we are met with what Peter has deemed as bad news when it comes to Jesus. Before we dive into our reading this morning, I want to give us some context. Right before our passage for today, in the same conversation, the disciples are asked by Jesus, who do you say that I am? The others answered, and Peter says, you are the Messiah. This was an incredible moment for Peter and Jesus. Peter has been with Jesus, traveled with him, learned from him, and now has come to understand and affirm who Jesus is. The Messiah, the one who we have been waiting for, the one who is to come and set us free, liberate us from Roman occupation, is here among us, teaching us, the Anointed One. This is good news. Our gospel reading for today picks up in the second half of that conversation, the part where Jesus shares the bad news to Peter and the disciples. The part about how Jesus must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. There is a great line in our gospel that I just love, right after Jesus says this, and it says, he said all this quite openly. Jesus didn't hold back. There was no mincing of Jesus' words. It was in this conversation that the disciples got a dose of reality. They got the good news with the bad. This bad news sends Peter into a bit of a spiral. He takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. To be fair to Peter, if the good news of Jesus being the Messiah is true, then in Peter's understanding, Jesus is the hero. He is the victor. He is the one who will liberate them from Roman oppression. He will set them free. Meanwhile, Jesus has taken this opportunity to share with them the theology of the cross, a theology of how God reveals God's self in weakness, in suffering, and in death. Peter is met in this moment with his own expectations of how all of this is going to go down. Peter wants glory. He wants a glory story. He doesn't want a cross story. He wants a story where God acts in the world the way he expects God to. Peter wants Jesus to do for him and for God's people what he expects. Instead, he is met with Jesus and the cross, a cross that contradicts everything people imagine God should be. The way things should be is not the way of God. God's self-revelation comes under the form of the cross and thus appears as foolishness and weakness to a world that looks for wisdom and strength in its God. The truth about who God is contradicts what we expect on the basis of our own feelings about the divine. To be clear, we are Peter. I am Peter. When we hear this story, when we read about Peter pulling Jesus aside to rebuke him, this is us. demanding that the truth of the story we are hearing cannot be true. It cannot be reality. If we are honest, we want a glory story too. And we want it all the time. Instead, we're met with a God who offers us the cross, a God who reveals God's self in weakness, in suffering, and in death. And this is good news. After Peter and Jesus have their little side conversation, Jesus called the crowd and the disciples together and says to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." As if what Jesus had said couldn't get any more scandalous, and then this is the follow-up to the news about the cross, about Jesus' suffering, about his rejection, and about his death. This is what is in store for all of them and us: denial of self, taking up our cross, and losing our lives just so we can find them again. At this point in the day, I can imagine that some of those gathered are looking around like, what is he saying? Am I signing up for this? And also looking for the easiest way out, trying to make a graceful exit. You know, when you find yourself in a crowd and realize this is not the place for you, let me just scooch on by here. Thank you, excuse me. I must be in the wrong place. This part of the gospel gets misused. It has been misused. It has been misused to try to get people to act right, to conform, to endure abuse for the sake of promises and marriage vows. I want to be clear that when you hear me preach on denying yourself and taking up your cross, you do not hear me say, nor hear Jesus say, straighten out, take the abuse, go back to the places and people that abused you. Instead, when Jesus says, deny yourself, maybe what he really means is that we need to deny the parts of ourselves that want to be separate from God and others. Deny the self that tells us we need to work harder, do better, try more. Deny the self that does not feel worthy of God's love. Deny the self that sees faith and spirituality as a program to avoid suffering. Deny the self that thinks it's more worthy of God's love than its enemy. Deny the self whose temperament is easier to be a jerk. Deny the self that believes you can do it all by yourself. Deny the self that believes grace is earned. When we are able to deny those parts of ourselves, when we are able to die to those false selves, and to be clear, we all have a little bit of them inside of us. It is dying to that false self, no matter how painful, we will be brought to real life. This is the move that Jesus is making here. This is what he's trying to teach us. There is so much of ourselves that is wrapped up in what we want, in who it is we expect God to be, and who it is what we expect Jesus to do for us. Peter wants a glory story. Instead, Jesus is calling us to the cross, calling us to take up our cross, calling us to lose our lives for the sake of the gospel so we can experience real life. I don't know where you are on this journey, and I can't know for certain the depths of the dualities of your good and bad news, and I can't imagine the pain, the confusion, and the setbacks and the heartbreaks you have endured. What I do know for certain is that we believe in a God who sent his son Jesus, whose way to redeem the world and us was through a cross. God is not conformed to human expectation or desires. God is found in uncertainty, in danger, and in suffering. God is found precisely where our human wisdom perceives God is absent. May we find the courage to do the hard work and deny the false selves that we carry around with us. May we, like our good friend Peter, come to trade our desire for a glory story and embrace the story of the cross. Because no matter how much our world has told us that this cross bears bad news, we know the truth. This is a good news story. This is a story of the cross and its transforming power that brings life from death. Amen.